Rise, Meg.
The Force will be with you.
It's certainly been a while since I've made a short documentary style video essay, but this is one that I've been planning to make for a very long time. Whether you loved them or despised them, you can't deny that the sequel trilogy was poorly planned from the get-go. While the three movies do bear their merit in terms of cinematography, nostalgia, and moments of brilliance, they are often criticised for the main protagonist. I'm of course talking about Rey. This video serves as a critical examination of the character of Rey and what I call her three faces. By this I mean how each film of the sequel trilogy portrayed her, and the reason why, despite them being individually well crafted, overall they were too inconsistent to work coherently in one trilogy of movies. I'll also be discussing strong character traits as well as where the writing let the character down immensely. I will also address the accusation made from many fans that Rey is a Mary Sue. That is, of course, a character who is entitled and didn't face as many challenges as she should have. I will state as a disclaimer that I'm going to argue both sides of this debate. I'm also going to throw out there that I think that Daisy Ridley is an absolutely outstanding actress. So my dear friends, as I always say on the channel, without any more jibber jabber, let's dive straight into the three faces of Rey. We begin with Face 1, Rey in The Force Awakens. When she was first introduced in 2015, Rey was mysterious and pretty interesting as well. As an audience, we had high expectations for her since she'd be taking on the main character role for a new Star Wars trilogy. The role that already had a high bar since Luke Skywalker and Anakin had filled that slot in the previous two trilogies. When Rey came onto the screen, things were very promising. We were introduced to a poor scavenger girl from Jakku who clearly seemed like she could hold her own and was very tactile, holding on to hope that her parents would return one day to come and get her. When fate and adventure took her away from Jakku and on a new path with Han, Finn and BB-8, we got a really awesome scene with Maz Kanata when the Skywalker saber called out to Rey. That scene was the most Star Warsy one we got in the entire movie, and we were all captivated as an audience. It was very evident that the Force was calling out to our protagonist, and she didn't know how to handle that calling. As Star Wars fans, we had so many questions. Where did this innocent space scavenger fit into the broader story that we'd come to know and love? Who in the galaxy were her parents? Why did they decide to abandon her on Jakku? And more broadly, who is she and why is the Force calling out to her? All was going swimmingly until we got this scene, where somehow, without any training or prior knowledge, Rey used a Jedi mind trick on a stormtrooper. Now, while some people might not see this as a big deal, it kind of is. It's the first time in the movie that was shown Rey's competence using the Force, and yet it's both nonsensical since she's never had any training, and secondly, it was combined with comedy, which for me at least, came across as a bit cringe.
I will remove these restraints and leave the cell with the door open.
Now I know that Star Wars is literally littered with comedy, but this was not the right moment to add a comedic musing. It's supposed to be a climactic moment where the protagonist's journey takes a powerful new direction, and yet it felt very underwhelming because of the delivery and the context of the scene. Now I'm going to fast forward to a more important moment in the movie, the scene with the lightsaber duel between Kylo and Rey. I had a lot of grievances with this scene because it was actually set up beautifully, but it was executed in a B-grade manner. Finn takes on Kylo Ren with the Skywalker saber and fails. Then we see that very saber swiveling in the snow. It's at this moment that even Mark Hamill himself admits would have been a great entrance for his character, as he uses the Force to take hold of the lightsaber as it finds its way into his hands.
Good. I'm writing all this down. I remember thinking, when I got to the scene, I hope everyone's seen it, but when the lightsaber jiggles in the forest and flies out of the snow, I went, oh baby, here I am.
But no, it finds its way to Rey instead, and she looks very perplexed. This facial expression is very significant, because hey, guess what? What do you know? She's able to duel against Kylo Ren as if she's a fully fledged Jedi Knight. A lot of people who defend this scene say that she's as powerful as she is because she turns out to be a Palpatine, but your lineage does not exempt you from having to train properly. So long story short, she defeats Kylo, and the movie ends with Rey going to Ahch-To Island to hand Luke Skywalker his saber. This was such a potent and incredible ending to the movie. Now my overall impressions of Rey by the end of The Force Awakens were surprisingly positive, because in my mind they were going to use episode 8 to explain her powers and give a lot more depth and context to her story. In the wake of the release of The Force Awakens, there were two main camps of Star Wars fans regarding their reactions. Some people thought that the film was excellent and a great revival for Star Wars. Yes, we have to admit that there were certainly a lot of recycled ideas from A New Hope, but overall, many believed that it's what fans needed as a way of getting back into the franchise, because at that point we hadn't had a major release since Revenge of the Sith, which was 10 years prior. These fans are the ones who couldn't wait to see Luke Skywalker back in action in Episode 8, now that Rey had found him on Arc-2 Island. I find myself in this camp of Star Wars fan, and I will never forget the final scene of the movie, with John Williams' masterpiece The Jedi Steps playing in the background as the film ended on a literal cliffhanger. I mean, what can I say? We were hungry for more and didn't want to wait 2 years for it. The second camp of Star Wars fans are those who are quick to call Rey a Mary Sue. As established earlier, a Mary Sue is the type of female character who is depicted as unrealistically lacking in flaws or weaknesses. Since Rey seemingly had immense skill with the lightsaber and was able to use advanced Force techniques reminiscent of a well-trained Jedi Knight even though she had no prior training, many fans called her out for demonstrating the traits of your typical run-of-the-mill Mary Sue. While I was tempted to join this camp, I didn't, because I had placed way too much trust in Lucasfilm that they would explain it in the next scheduled cinematic release, Episode 8. And that brings us on to The Last Jedi. We move on to face number 2, Rey Nobody. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I believe that this face of Rey was the best one in the entire sequel trilogy. While it was perhaps not a good continuation from The Force Awakens, I wholeheartedly believe that Rey in The Last Jedi was the best portrayal of the character, not because she was particularly strong or had a lot of hardship, but because of this scene in the cave on Arc-2 Island. To be conservative with my words, this scene was infamous. But that wasn't always the case because so many fans had so many fan theories to do with what it meant. We'll talk about fan reception in a minute, but first let's take a look at what happens in this scene and what it represents on a deeper level. On Arc-2, Rey has a Dagobah-like moment. Star Wars has always been circular, and that's why it's no surprise that there are similarities in the journeys between Anakin, Luke, and Rey, as they each navigate the middle parts of their trilogies. In Star Wars The Last Jedi, Rey's trials bear strong resemblances to those that Anakin and Luke faced, and it's something that feels like it's by design. As StarWars.com puts it, Rey's trip inside the mirror cave scene strongly resembles Luke's test on Dagobah against the spectre of Vader, and the imagery even goes as far back to Anakin's trip to the well of the dark side in the Mortis trilogy in the Clone Wars. Each of these three protagonists experience visions of the Force, and each of them are tailored to their own unique destinies and problems. In the Mortis trilogy, for example, Anakin Skywalker is shown what he will become, and when he learns of this, he directly turns to the dark, willing to embrace the evil inside himself to prevent any greater atrocities in the future. He sees himself as Vader reflected in the vision, and this explains the key flaw in Anakin that terrifies Luke about Rey so much. That Anakin was so willing to go straight to the dark if he perceives a payoff in the light. Anakin is shown the worst of himself and embraces those same qualities before his mind is quickly wiped after he fails the test. It doesn't matter though, ultimately he still becomes Darth Vader. Years later in The Empire Strikes Back on Dagobah, Yoda tells Luke that the only thing in the cave, which he describes as a domain of evil, is what he takes with him. When Yoda explains that he won't need his weapons either, Luke brings the lightsaber regardless, and Luke is confronted with the thing that he's most terrified of, Vader. Luke's mistake was bringing his lightsaber to confront Vader, but he didn't know then that he would need to discard it in favour of love in order to defeat Vader, although Yoda did warn him. And when he struck Vader, cutting off his head, what does he see? His own terrified face reflected in his fear. Was this to mean that Vader was always a Skywalker, or that Luke could turn down the path of Vader? Regardless of the answer, it's something that's been debated amongst Star Wars fans all the way back since 1980. Like Anakin and Luke before her, Rey is called to a well of the dark side to confront her fear. For Rey, this fear is her lack of belonging and her emotional reliance on her parents. And when she falls into the water and crawls out, this is the only request she has for the dark mirror. And what did it show her? That the sense of belonging that she'd been seeking comes from within herself. She was really her own parent, her own guiding force that got her through the difficulties of life as a scavenger. It's also interesting to note that the imagery of Rey and Anakin's respective wells of the dark side are opposites. Anakin's is set deep in a flow of boiling lava, bright red and hot. Rey's is in a cold, damp place surrounded by water. Luke's is a middle ground between the two in a steamy, swampy marsh, both hot and wet, a bridge between the two. It makes one wonder what Ben Solo's test would have been if he had been placed in the same situation as Rey. All of these visions lead characters to similar situations where they need to make a life or death decision based on the revelations in their past. In Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, Luke's vision comes true in a sense when Vader reveals his true identity to Luke.
No, I am your father.
There is a Skywalker in the Vader suit, and Luke has to grapple with the truth of his own identity as well. In essence, if his father was inside Vader, could there be a Vader inside of him? Rey has to grapple with this in the opposite sense. The mirror shows Rey her own face and she's not ready to confront what it means. That's one of the many reasons the tears roll down her face when Kylo forces her to confront the truth after Snoke's death. She just doesn't want to admit that Maz Kanata told her plainly in The Force Awakens that her family was never coming back. The cave scene in The Last Jedi is completely misunderstood, particularly amongst sequel haters. What people simply fail to realise is that this scene, and in a broader sense the entirety of Episode 8, is one giant metaphor.
It's time to let old things die.
Rian Johnson essentially moved away from the standard equation of Star Wars as we'd known it until that point, and made the viewers realise that you don't have to be related to somebody famous to have an impact, and anybody can access the Force. Of course, J.J. Abrams ruined that with The Rise of Skywalker when he decided to make Rey Palpatine at the very last minute, but we'll come on to Episode 9 shortly. When Kylo Ren forces her to accept the truth that she is a nobody, he adds the powerful line, "but not to me." For the first time in the Skywalker Saga, we had a dynamic that nobody was used to. That a nobody who desperately wanted to be a somebody was in fact no one, and yet the Force is still for anyone. Rey being a nobody would have been the best twist for the sequel trilogy if Colin Trevorrow was able to use that in his initial Episode 9 Duel of the Fates. Maybe then the trilogy would have been a lot more coherent. But let's not get too complimentary, because then we got The Rise of Skywalker. By the time Episode 9 was announced, Lucasfilm knew that they were in hot water. After Solo, a Star Wars story bombed because fans were disgruntled with The Last Jedi, they needed to do something big for Episode 9. So randomly, out of the blue, after firing Colin Trevorrow and bringing in J.J. Abrams to complete the trilogy, Lucasfilm decided, let's bring Palpatine back. Now, while it is true that George Lucas had always planned on bringing back Palpatine, throwing him into the mix in the last movie with no prior warning was not the right way to do it. And while I fangirled really hard when I heard Palpatine's laugh in Episode 9's teaser trailer, it was completely random, and a very obvious attempt to get asses into cinema seats. So in what way does this apply to our protagonist? Well, for better or worse, J.J. Abrams completely threw out what Rian Johnson had set up and said fuck it, she needs a backstory. Daisy Ridley admitted that there was no plan for her lineage in the sequels, and they had even played around with the notion of her being a Kenobi before throwing in that she was a Palpatine at the literal very last minute. Now, I'm super disappointed as a Star Wars fan that so little care was put into the sequel trilogy after George Lucas had trusted Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy to use his rough drafts containing a storyline for the final 3 films of the franchise. While I did think that The Rise of Skywalker was adequate, Rey in Episode 9 wasn't, not by any stretch, especially compared to what she was like in Episode 8. First of all, the entire cast of this movie had literally checked out emotionally months before the movie even dropped in theatres, and even the acting felt forced a lot of the time. But focusing on our girl Rey, I felt as though her character lacked any kind of oomph in this movie, and it was so disappointing. So the big reveal of this film is that Rey is the granddaughter of Palpatine, but honestly, what was the point? Rey defeated Palpatine way too easily, and in doing so, gave the middle finger to her Palpatine lineage. Her defeating Granddaddy Palps completely destroyed and undermined Anakin's arc and legacy. Now, a lot of people say that the Force couldn't be balanced forever, and that eventually the galaxy would need a new hero. This is very true, except one thing. Why did the villain have to be the exact same one? You may as well have called the movie The Rise of Palpatine, because the film confirmed that Sheev has literally been behind every ill event in the entirety of this saga. But let's talk about something positive for a minute. The Dark Force vision where Rey saw herself as Empress Palpatine, also known as Darkside Rey. In my opinion, this was really awesome, and it's just a damn shame that the movie didn't do anything with this idea. They just kind of showed Rey for a few seconds what she might become if she isn't careful. But this wasn't the only moment of the movie that exhibited Rey as a dark side user. She used Force lightning, which visually and emotionally was freaking amazing. I know this scene gets a lot of criticism, but pair it with the dark side vision, and you know what? Instantly, you have a Rey who has twice as much depth as a character. I really love the concept of dark side Rey, how a nobody scavenger from Jakku is related to Palpatine and gives into the darkness because of her raw, untamed power. It would do a lot of justice to her Mary Sue-like abilities in The Force Awakens. I mean, if you're going to bring Palpatine back, why not have Rey turn to the dark side and end the trilogy on a dark twist? Then make episodes 10 to 12 in 20 years' time when Empress Palpatine has taken over the galaxy and we have a new hero who is trained properly and destroys her and her new empire. I mean, heck, you could even have Grogu be the hero, but I digress, because The Rise of Skywalker had a very vanilla ending with a side of kicking Star Wars fans in the balls by Rey declaring herself a Skywalker. I've spoken about this on my Patreon before, but I don't think she merits the name Skywalker. Either way, the movie ends with her and BB-8 on Tatooine looking out on the binary sunset, just like Luke did in A New Hope. When the movie ended, I really felt hard done by as a Star Wars fan, and it wasn't even because of the Rey Skywalker thing. It was because I realised that halfway through the movie, I didn't even care about Rey anymore. J.J. Abrams really dampened her down, and the only character I cared for in the second half of the movie was Ben Solo and his redemption. By the time Rey identified herself as the adopted daughter of the Skywalker twins, I was thinking, okay, great. And it's a shame because this trilogy could have been so much more and could have been saved with so few adjustments, and yet they made the whole thing harder for themselves with no plan, losing the trust of Star Wars fans in the process. Now look, I completely understand that many people loved the sequels, and I myself do enjoy rewatching them. But as diehard Star Wars fans who buy all the merch, who camp outside the theatre the day before the big releases, who live and breathe this franchise, we have every right to make criticisms towards the movies when we feel as though Lucasfilm could and should have done better. So I'm going to conclude with this. Watching Rey's journey in the sequel trilogy was at times amazing, yet frustrating, and ended with blatant mediocrity. For me, the second face of Rey, which was Rey Nobody, was the best version of this character. Daisy Ridley is an incredible actress who I personally would love to see reprise the role again in the future someday. Something which she has admitted that she is open to, but watching the inconsistent arc that her character underwent in episodes 7, 8 and 9 should be a lesson to Lucasfilm to plan the storyline of the protagonist in advance so that the directors who come in are able to shine and add their own magic to the phenomenal franchise that we all love, which is a million times better than be criticised because they were set up to fail from the get-go. Unlike a lot of other Star Wars YouTubers, I believe that Star Wars is alive and well, and better days are certainly to come. With the amazing reception of The Mandalorian and with the vast multitudes of projects and spin-offs in the work for Disney+, this is truly a wonderful time to be a Star Wars fan. My dear friends, I wish you all a phenomenal rest of the day, no matter where you dwell in the galaxy, and remember that the Force will be with you, always.